Kristallnacht, what does it signify? I can only say what it signifies to me. I'm the child of two survivors. My mother was 7 years old at the time. She was a reluctant student in Lublin, Poland, in many ways a typical young child of the time. It is unlikely that in 1938, before the German occupation, she would have given much, if any, thought to the violence erupting in neighboring Germany. But my father, a 19-year-old medical student in Vilna, followed the threatening developments closely, and without a doubt, Kristallnacht must have been a key factor in his eventual decision to flee Europe for Palestine. To him, I'm sure it served as a warning, an alarm sounded from just across the border in Germany that life could not be peaceful for Jews living under the Third Reich. To me, Kristallnacht signifies a few things: the breakdown of order, the death of neighborly trust, the specific danger of walking while Jewish in Nazi Germany. Today, Kristallnacht is viewed through the lens of history as a line, a demarcation of where before ends and after begins. But it really wasn't a line, not to the people living through it. It was really part of a much larger, longer, harder to perceive drifting, a slow, erratic, unpredictable, nonlinear erosion of social norms. For example, as early as March of 1933, just a couple of months after Hitler took power as chancellor, conductor Bruno Walter, a Jew, was scheduled to conduct a special concert of the Berlin Philharmonic. But as of January, Jewish involvement in all things cultural, scientific, or academic was being systematically erased. The Nazis called this de-Judification, and it was taken very seriously because it was not simply an effort to eliminate the presence of Jewish influences, but as the Nazi ideology saw it, German culture had been distorted from within by Jewish culture, which, akin to a virus, derived its nourishment from its host. And it needed to be pulled out from the roots and cleared away to allow German culture to recover as its own pure ideal. Bruno Walter was not forcibly removed from the podium of the concert hall. He was not even overtly banned from performing. He was simply advised that if he were to conduct that night's concert, there was a possibility that rogue zealots may just burn down the concert hall. And it was suggested that in order to keep the peace, he should maybe voluntarily withdraw. If the conversation were happening in today's vernacular, he would have been asked to take one for the team. So he did not conduct, and instead he packed his bags and fled Germany. In case you're wondering, the show did go on. Richard Strauss conducted in his place. I mention this example because there was absolutely nothing violent about it. It was essentially a quiet conversation, albeit one that raised the possibility of a fire. What's most confusing and pernicious about the Nazi appeal to Bruno Walter is that it is just that, an appeal, giving the illusion that the conductor has any role to play in the decision-making process. While the events of November 9th and 10th, 1938 were overtly violent and disorienting, they were absolutely constructed of the same cloth as every other effort by the new German authorities to strip Jews of their positions of first significance and leadership, and eventually simply citizenship and humanity. The acts themselves may look and feel different, but the consistent thread that binds this all up into one recognizable pattern is a foundation of lies. Lies regarding the motivation for the action, lies about the actual decision-making process, lies about the perpetrators, lies about the supposed role played by the victims, and ultimately lies about the possible effects on their future existence. The first time I heard the word perfidious, it was used by my mother to capture the uniquely deceitful, malevolent, and inexhaustible pattern of deception employed by the Nazi German government in almost every act directed at Jews. In my mother's memoir, Dry Tears, she describes how she, her sister, and parents survived the war to emerge as one of only 4 intact Jewish families from Lublin, a Polish city with a pre-war Jewish population of roughly 300,000. In her subsequent 6 books on rescue and resistance during the war, she zeroes in on some key factors necessary for survival under extreme conditions. In her decades of research conducting hundreds of interviews with both survivors and the Christian Poles who risked their lives to save them, she claims to have found not one example of a person who survived the war completely alone. It would seem that our very survival requires mutual cooperation. Furthermore, when she attempted to identify the common characteristics of those who acted to save lives, she was initially puzzled when the usual sociological categories didn't seem to predict who among the Polish Catholic population would act to save Jews. Social status or class, religiosity, urban versus rural, educational background, relative wealth, etc., etc. None of these categories seem to appear in anything remotely akin to a pattern. But slowly, over years of research, she began to discern some factors which lay beneath those more obvious means of categorization. And I think that today, more than ever, it is absolutely essential that we remind ourselves of these 3 factors which consistently appeared in the profiles of almost every righteous Christian Nechama Tec interviewed. Regardless of whether they were leaders or outcasts, most of these individuals were sort of on the periphery of whatever social world they were living in. In some cases, this was the result of extraordinary accomplishment or leadership. In other cases, it was the result of a kind of failed outcast status. But in any case, most of these individuals did not fit easily into conventional social structures, and as a result, they were more free to think for themselves and act accordingly, and they had learned to be their own moral compass. Second, all these individuals had established pre-war patterns of helping. So, for example, if they saw a beggar on the street, they would dig into their pocket or their purse to give them some change. Or maybe in their family, they were the one person who could always be counted on to give an extra help in times of need. In many cases, their pre-war acts were minor, almost inconsequential, like stopping to alert someone that their shoelace is untied, or picking up a bill that had gone floating out of someone's purse, crossing to the other side of the road because a cart is coming in your direction. These are things that are not life-altering, but they show a kind of pattern of an instinct to help and a kind of way of being in the world. And they establish a pattern of behavior, and we are ruled by habits, and they are difficult to shake off. And no matter what the circumstances that suggest we may be better off doing something else. If we're used to doing something one way, we tend to do it that way. Finally, the last thing is that in almost every case, rescuers did not sit down for days or hours even to ponder the pros and cons of whether they should or shouldn't risk their lives to save person X or person Y. No, it just sort of happened. It kind of unfolded. It just kind of found its way into their life. A person showed up in the middle of the night, and what were they going to do? Turn them away? Or a possibility for a camouflaged mode of transport from one city to another suddenly presented itself, and so swiftly, without much thought, arrangements were made to get person from point A to point B. Beyond my mother's research into the subject of rescue and resistance, I think there are some important factors to consider in the way that her father conducted himself socially that may tell us something about human connection and navigating the turbulent water of times of upheaval. Interestingly, in my father's story, a similar pattern of connectedness being very important emerges. I just want to give you two examples, one from my mother's wartime experience and one from my father's, to illustrate the value of human bonds with acquaintances, co-workers. These are not the kinds of bonds, these are not family bonds. These are kind of more casual bonds. Okay, so two quick examples. As I mentioned at the start of the war, my father was completing his medical studies in Vilna. He was one of 6 Jewish students admitted to his class through a commonly accepted quota system at the time. Although technically, for a year or so after German occupation of Poland, Lithuania was a neutral independent state, anti-Semitism was igniting all over Europe, especially on university campuses, where right-wing allied student groups grew increasingly violent. My father was always curious about people. He just loved to get to know them, no matter who they were or how he met them. And that may be why he ended up becoming a psychiatrist. He didn't shrink me, but he somehow always ended up forming little attachments with people that other people in his world would overlook. One such person was the janitor in the medical school building. My father and the janitor discovered that they had similar taste in women, so they would talk about that. And that they would also talk about music, which the janitor liked a lot. So they would often, in breaks between class, my father would find the janitor and talk. One day, Dad walks into school, and the janitor pulls him into his storage closet and says, the Endics, now the Endics were the right-wing political student group at the time. The Endics are planning a violent action against the Jewish students at the end of the school day today. They're going to be waiting along this path where you have to exit the building with bats and pipes, and they're going to beat the Jews to a pulp. So the janitor begged my father, don't leave the building, stay with me, we'll have a cup of tea, we'll sit and talk in my office, and you can just wait it out. So together they sat and waited and talked, and until they heard sort of the noise dissipate, and then it was dark and no one was out there anymore, and my father was able to leave the medical school building without ending up in the hospital. This is the direct result of his having a relationship with this person. In fact, things at medical school for my dad would get more and more tense and unpredictable once the Germans had defeated Poland. Finally, in 1940, with less than 2 months remaining in his last semester of medical school, my father fled Europe for Palestine. At the time, his Jewish friends in medical school told him that he was crazy, to leave without his degree, that he was making a stupid, unnecessary, emotional mistake. Years later, he would learn that not one of them survived the war. The thing is, though, I spent some time in Lithuania making the film Defiance, and in 1939, you would not have expected Vilnius or Vilna to have been the killing center that it turned into, because Vilnius was known as Jerusalem of Lithuania. It was home to one of the largest Jewish populations, and in fact, before my father fled Europe, many of his friends from other parts of Poland were streaming in to Vilnius in hopes of escaping Nazi terror, because Lithuania was neutral. But then, as it turned out, the Lithuanians proved themselves to be extremely enthusiastic co-murderers with the Germans, and it was not a safe place to be. My mother and her sister survived the war with the help of several Polish Catholics, some who sheltered them as cousins from the other side of the country, others who offered help in the form of advice, directions, the name of a contact. Almost every arrangement, situation, journey from one town to another, job, or other piece of the puzzle of her family's survival had been arranged by my grandfather, Roman. Roman was orphaned at the age of 14. My grandfather, who I never met and I am named after, he was a self-made and cunning businessman. At the start of the war, he owned a small but successful candle-making factory in the heart of Lublin. Lublin was Poland's industrial center. By the time the war began, anyone who had been paying attention understood that Jewish-owned businesses in Nazi Germany would swiftly be scooped up and converted into property of the Reich. Kristallnacht had occurred just a little less than a year before the arrival of German tanks and bombs into Poland. One of the most perfidious elements of the design of Kristallnacht involved the subsequent denial of insurance claims filed by Jewish businesses and the legal imposition of severe penalties for business owners who failed to clean up and repair damage done to their storefronts. In another strange example of German deception, with seemingly no purpose other than cruel disorientation, the German government first allowed insurers to process the claims and give the Jewish business owners the money. Then, in a bureaucratic sleight of hand, the government swiftly confiscated all settlement payments, then leaving the Jewish business owners with the daunting challenge of complying with the legal requirement that the shops be repaired. This really amounted to a first step in the eventual confiscation of all Jewish property to support the Reich. My grandfather had always maintained a close relationship with his foreman and with the workers, most of whom were Polish Catholics. His foreman, in particular, admired my grandfather and thought of him as a mentor. He had learned the candle-making business from my grandfather. Upon news of swift Polish military defeats on the front, Roman took the unusual step of arranging for the immediate transfer of ownership of his factory from his name into his foreman's name. By doing this, he shielded the factory from the threat of German confiscation, because the Germans came into Poland and they took anything that was Jewish-owned. But if it was Polish Catholic-owned, they left it alone. It was understood that this arrangement would be temporary if, at the end of the war, my grandfather was able to return to Lublin and the factory. But when the war did finally end, and Roman and my mother and her sister and his wife, they returned to Lublin after having lived in several different parts of Poland during the war. The factory and the foreman's family invited them to dinner. They were all sitting there at dinner and talking. And it was sort of clear to my grandfather in that moment that not only was the factory not going to be his, not because of any malice on the part of the foreman, but just because of what had happened. The factory was not going to be his, but also Poland was not going to be his. And he decided to move his family on. We don't, unfortunately, get to choose the larger political landscape on which we build our lives. If, as luck would have it, we find ourselves living in a world permeated with mistrust, greed, corruption, selfishness, and danger, we stand a much better chance not only of surviving, but of living and possibly even thriving if we stay open, curious, and invested in the world of people who share our little corner of it. In the daily act of simply meeting our neighbors where they are, we and they might slowly begin to feel a part of something akin to a web. Not a World Wide Web, no, but a local web. One which experience tells us should be durable enough to break our fall and help us right ourselves for the next leg of life's journey.